We're going to be joined right now by my colleague, Andrew Kraft, and also father, friend of the program, Ryan Muldoon. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. We spoke yesterday about what this moment would be like. When you hear the name Robert Prevost, now the next Pope, Pope Leo XIV, what's your reaction, Ryan?
I was stunned. There was a little bit of a gap between his first and his middle name, and when we got Prevost, and I said, Robert Francis. I think I've heard that before. And then the news came, and I was with some priests and seminarians here in Yonkers, New York, where I teach, and the room went silent. We couldn't believe that the first American Pope had been elected.
That is so very exciting. Have you ever had an audience with this Pope, with the former now Cardinal Robert Prevost?
I never have, although we share an alma mater. He studied canon law. He studied church law at a university in Rome, where I too did my studies. My sister, who's a Villanova alumnus, I think they're going to be as insufferable as ever. I say that in jest. But she says that already her Villanova friends are going wild.
Yeah, Andrew Kraft is joining me. I know you're so stunned like the rest of the world. Father Ryan, before we continue on with this conversation, what was the initial reaction? Because you hear him speak, you learn a little bit about his background as we're kind of somewhat gathering some of that information. I do want to put up just a little bit of a fact sheet on who now Pope Leo XIV is. Of course, from Chicago, Illinois, age of 69, attended, like you mentioned, Villanova University. He made a cardinal in 2023 by Pope Francis, appointed the first American Pope in 2,000 years of history in terms of the Catholic Church. How will Pope Leo now shape the Catholic Church, just based on what we know, based on who he is?
As we were saying yesterday, we expect from any pope a certain amount of continuity with the pope who came before him, but also making his own mark. We know that Pope Francis appointed Cardinal Prevost first as a bishop and then made him a cardinal more recently, appointed him to a pretty significant Vatican post where he had a hand in choosing the names of men who were submitted to the Pope to become bishops. So we expect some continuity, certainly with Pope Francis, but he'll bring his own mark. I noted in the remarks he gave from the balcony, from the loggia, he talked about wanting peace, not just for Catholics, but for all peoples. He kept emphasizing all peoples. And so I see him reaching out just to the Catholic community, but to the worldwide, the global community.
You know, Father Muldoon, Andrew Kraft here, so good to be with you. And I think the key word for everyone today is stunned. I'm going to keep saying it all day because I'm still reeling from the shock. And not only Americans, I think so many Catholics around the world were not anticipating this or expecting this. I guess my question to you is, you know, if we can, I know it's somewhat of a futile effort, here inside the conclave, it's so secretive, it's so closed off, and it's meant to be. What endeared the bishop there, Prevost, to the other cardinals inside, do you think? You know, we're probably never going to get a vote tally. This was all done on the fourth ballot. We saw the white smoke here. What do you think really endeared him inside the Sistine Chapel to his fellow cardinals in the College of Cardinals, who ultimately decide, this is our man, this is our guy, he is going to lead the church? What do you think it was about him, particularly, you know, set aside the American citizenship for just a moment?
I think he brings a global mindset. By my rough crunch of the numbers, I think he spent about 36 years in the United States, 20 years in Peru, and 13 in Rome. So he's got this global experience of the church in Latin America, his being raised in the United States, but then working in different postings as the head of his religious order in Rome, and then at a chief Vatican office. So he brings a great variety of perspectives. I think we might ask too, what should we glean from his choice of a name? And he'll have the chance to tell the world why it is he chose the name Pope Leo XIV. But we think of Pope Leo XIII, who was called the social pope, the one very close to workers, advocating for the rights of laborers. So he brings a global experience, but also I think he wants to be close to the people in the way that Pope Francis was, in the way that his predecessor, Pope Leo XIII, was.
Yeah, there's a very good point, and we will hopefully hear from him, Pope Leo himself, about that decision to it. But you also mentioned, just as Pope Francis was kind of proclaiming himself the Pope for the poor right off the bat, just with his attire, with the robes that he chose, with his first initial message. What did you learn? What did you glean from some of those aspects of it? Because you are in the College of Cardinals. They are 133 of them. They receive these 89 votes or even more. And then the transition happens really in less than an hour. What did you really learn about what the Pope, the Pontiff, will be moving forward based on what we saw, based on what we heard?
I think we'll have to wait and see. But we note just from the way he was dressed in the way that popes have traditionally come out after a papal conclave. Pope Francis notably came out in a little more simpler attire, but Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, came out in ways that we've seen popes through the centuries approach that historic moment of being introduced to the world.
You know, I think it's so interesting that, you know, inside the conclave itself, you got to get to that magic number of 89. Obviously, he did. And the name Cardinal Prevost, I don't want to call it a dark horse throughout the entire process. You know, after Francis died, so many of these names were kind of put out there and bandied about as who were the key contenders. And his name did surface, so it's not like he was this extremely, you know, dark horse figure that just came out of nowhere. Obviously, his, you know, American citizenship, him being from the United States, is what's going to be so historic about this. But I have to ask, because he is an American Pope, and you heard there from Rebecca Castor that, and she was kind of reporting that, you know, some of the cardinals were somewhat reluctant or hesitant historically to elevate an American cardinal to the Supreme Pontiff, because frankly, the United States is the global hegemon, the world superpower, and to have American influence in this other major world institution, that's a lot of power. Do you buy that argument? Is that something the Cardinals even considered?
You know, Andrew, I don't know. We don't know what went on inside the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Sure, that's discussed often in papal conclaves that they don't want an election American. But we know that Robert Prevost, Pope Leo, is much more than that. Yeah. Yes, he is an American by birth, but he's got this diversity of experience. He brings this sort of global resume. And I thought it was interesting that he spoke as we would expect the Pope to do, both in Latin and in Italian. But then he chose to say a few words in Spanish, especially to the diocese in Peru where he had been bishop. He didn't speak in English. I don't know if we should make too much of that, but I think it just shows that he's already threading that needle well of yes, being an American, but being more than that.
I wanted to ask you about that because that was an interesting point. We had to do some research on this, if this was ever the first really true English-speaking Pope. And obviously, it's not necessarily that the case, but as we mentioned with Pope Francis, his Spanish-speaking, he was able to communicate. I remember hearing comments from different people at the Archdiocese there in Los Angeles talking about how they were able to speak Spanish with him. How important is it to be able to speak all of these different languages, and how unique is it that although he did not speak English at this really first moment as Pope Leo, but how crucial could that be and beneficial to people here in America, people that speak English?
I think of my own bishop, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who was one of the electors. And just before heading into the conclave, he gave an interview where he mentioned some characteristics that he was going to look for in a future pope. And he mentioned one was that he would be a linguist, that he'd be gifted linguistically, that he'd be able to communicate in a variety of languages, which we know is true of Pope Leo. So he's not just going to be someone who's going to be heard in translation, but he's going to be heard by many people around the world in their native tongue.
Ask, you know, have you spoken to Cardinal Dolan? We had heard so much from Cardinal Dolan in the run-up to the conclave. So many people were asking him, do you think there's going to be an American Pope? I was asking people like yourself all throughout the last couple of days, what are the chances of an American Pope? And they were telling me were slim. The chances were slim, but they were not zero. Obviously, we now know the chances were even greater. What has Cardinal Dolan said? Have you been in touch with him? What does he think about the news?
I've not been in touch with them. I imagine the Cardinals are sort of just getting back on the grid, so to speak. Remember, they were sequestered. They had their technology taken away. So they're probably just collecting their cell phones from having turned them in. But it'll be interesting to hear from Cardinal Dolan and from the other American cardinals what it means to them to have one of their brothers from the U.S. elected.
So I just have to ask, and this is maybe kind of an open-ended question, maybe there is no answer. The election of an American pope, you know probably more than most and better than most, here stateside, that church attendance is down. It's pretty low. You can make that argument worldwide. We know that the Catholic populations of the faithful are growing in parts of the world like Asia and Africa. Do you anticipate a factor for American Catholics that they can recommit to their faith in the wake of a American Pope being elected? Do you think we're going to see maybe some type of phenomenon for American Catholics to come back to the church in the wake of this, or is it too early to tell?
I certainly hope so, Andrew. We've already seen some of this begin. Some of the statistics tell us that church attendance, while it has been lower of late, that it's either plateauing and if not increasing. We've seen that, anecdotally here in New York, especially as we've just celebrated Easter. And so I hope that what really seems to have already begun in terms of people's resurgence in their own faith, reconnecting with their roots, especially those who were raised Catholic, and also those who might be embracing Catholicism for the very first time. I hope that the election of an American Pope, the first, will help that along.
And obviously you talk about that and the global reach that this Pope Leo will have here in America, but beyond, of course, now the bishop there in Rome as well. I want to ask you, because he's age 69 years old. We saw Pope Francis have a 12-year term, and you don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it feels like he could have some time in this role as Pope. Do you think that is beneficial to him to have a Pope that's going to be there potentially for quite a few years, maybe decades, in this role to cement what he wants to accomplish? How important do you think that is?
Andy, I think that's quite true. He doesn't have to rush to get accomplished whatever he might see as wanting to be, those priority projects that he wants to attend to. He is, because of his age, he has the ability to just approach it thoughtfully, slowly, prayerfully, to study what it is the church needs in this age and the years ahead. He doesn't have to rush into it. He's already got a head start. Remember, he was in this key Vatican post where he was involved in the selection of bishops for around the world. So he knows Rome, he knows the church in Rome, but he also knows the church globally. And so he's got a good running start on what will be ahead for him as now our Holy Father.
Father, I think a lot of people are wondering and asking themselves, I'm asking myself this, what does a pope do on the first day of the job? This is a supreme task before him. He is kind of ushered into this position that only 266 other men have been in for the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. What do you do on day one?
Well, I hope that tonight he does the 2 P's, prayer and pasta, right? As any good Roman, I hope he has a big bowl of pasta ready for him. But I imagine he'll be approaching this moment in prayer. We know that in the days ahead, the times where we will see him publicly will be moments of prayer, especially we'll be awaiting the announcement of when the inauguration Mass will be for the new Pope.
That is so very exciting. Pope Ryan Muldoon, thank you so much. I appreciate your time here on Live Now from Fox. A special time, a historic moment, the first American Pope. And as we talked, we'll continue to discuss what he will impart upon this role, so very crucial, but like Andrew Kraft said, so very stunning as well, as we kind of get our bearings on the time moving forward. Thank you again. I appreciate your time here on Live Now from Fox.
Andrew, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great conversation there, as always, as a live look one more time at St. Peter's Square as we are following the latest with this. The first American Pope takes the name of Leo XIV. And as we noted, obviously the American roots so very strong. Latin America, as Peru, a strong basis for his upbringing as well. But Chicago, Philadelphia, to name a few, are important. Let's take you right now out to, I believe this is in Chicago, as they were talking about some of these reactions from this in Chicago. Let's just listen in to what they had to say, reacting in real time. The stunning news, the first American Pope, Cardinal Robert Prevost, taking the name Leo. Let's listen in to some of these comments here on Live Now.
Great joy, great excitement. I do believe that Pope Leo XIV is going to serve with obviously great faith. He's a very humble, a very kind person, and someone who really does look to the Lord for guidance in all that he does. He's a very prayerful and spiritual man, and he's going to take that sense of God's love and do all that he can to care for all of God's children, to care for all of us. So I have not personally worked with him, but I do know people who have worked with him. He's as an Augustinian. There's a large Augustinian community here in the Chicagoland area, and they all speak so incredibly highly of him. He's just a really wonderful, wonderful man who is guided by a sense of God's love. So we have no inside information whatsoever. You've heard this quoted time and time again. The cardinal who walks into the conclave as a pope walks out a cardinal. So there's all kind of speculation. He certainly, as a cardinal, was eligible to be elected, but it's a surprise in the sense that nobody really knows how the Holy Spirit is going to move among the cardinals in the conclave. They don't walk in with a set plan or a set agenda. They go in with a spirit of prayer, seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, it's a surprise in that sense. Certainly. So the Augustinian community is based upon St. Augustine, and the Augustinians live in community, and they have wonderful institutions of education, both higher and lower education. So run high schools, universities. Villanova is certainly the most prominent of those universities. They serve as pastors of parishes. They really take care of the people of God in a wide variety of ways with a special devotion to St. Augustine, that rule in which they're called to live their lives. They come together to pray. They share meals together. There's that Augustinian spirituality that they bring. There's any number of religious orders, and then Father Greg and I are both secular priests, so I was ordained for the Archdiocese of Chicago and then named a bishop by Pope Francis. The Augustinians are ordained into a community, not into a specific location. So that's kind of like the biggest difference.
All right, just listening in there, the Archdiocese of Chicago, people continuing to react to this news of the Cardinal Robert Prevost being elected to Pope, taking on the name Leo. And of course, a live picture right now there at St. Peter's Square, just past about 9:20 local time. And from St. Peter's Square all the way to Cloud Gate in Chicago, people continue to react. Catholics continue to react around the world. Let's bring into the conversation right now Catholic theologian, friend of the program, Rich Rayo. Thank you so much. You are from Chicago. Rich, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox as we talk about stunning news, the American-born Cardinals elected as Pope. What was your initial reaction? And I know you have met him previously. What are your biggest takeaways?
Well, stunned at first. But as this news sunk in of his election, it became clear that he's the Pope at this particular moment that the Cardinals have chosen. I think that in now Pope Leo the 14th, we see a social justice warrior. He obviously took his name after Leo XIII, who published the encyclical Rerum Novarum, in which he then set the ground for Catholic social thought as we know it today. He's a humble, heartwarming, peaceful man, but he's also a decisive man. And I think that the Cardinals, for some reason, surprised us by this choice. Although he was on the list of papibile, he was certainly not one of the top contenders that was being named.
Rich, so good of you to be with us. And I just have to kind of give my observations here of the American flags being unfurled and waved there in St. Peter's Square upon the announcement that the first American pope in the church's history was elected in Cardinal Prevost, to me was quite striking for so many, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, especially in the United States. That must have been quite stirring. And I have to ask you this, I don't want to be overwrought about the historic nature of the first U.S. Pope. We're going to hear so much about that. That's going to be kind of the footnote, maybe not the footnote, maybe the lead in Leo XIV's biography here. But to our previous guest's point, Father Muldoon, he wasn't only, American with a U.S. passport. He spent 2 decades in Peru. He spent more than a decade in Rome. This is going to be a very worldly pope, and rightly so. And I want to just get to the particular order that he was a part of. We know that Francis was a Jesuit, and Leo XIV from the Order of St. Augustine. He was an Augustinian. What does that mean? What's the philosophy of the Augustinians?
Sure. The Augustinians are primarily a teaching order. In fact, he is a graduate of an Augustinian high school on the south side of Chicago, and also a grad of Villanova University in Philly. And so the charism, if you will, of the Augustinian order is that of education. But with that being said, they are also a missionary order. As you mentioned, Pope Leo XIV spent time in Peru for a long time as a missionary. And so as much as he is a U.S. citizen, he has served abroad. He has run a diocese before. He was previously, until Pope Francis passed away, the prefect for the Congregation for Bishops, which means he was in charge of appointing bishops or recommending bishops to be appointed to Pope Francis up until the time of his passing. And so he's got a grasp not only on the local church, but on the global church as well.
And you mentioned that, and one of the quotes that big takeaways, although he did not speak in English as a Chicago born, talking about building bridges and keep our arms open so we can all walk together. You mentioned the fact that he took the name Leo after the 13th, now the 14th. You called him a social warrior. In terms of how he will shape his role there as pontiff, but also looking back on what we saw Pope Francis did, do you think it will be a continuation of what we saw in terms of Pope Francis now to Pope Leo?
Pope Francis made him a cardinal just last year. So in terms of continuity between pontificates, I think we can see that. Each pope has his different style and different charism. Pope Leo, I would say, is more low key. And that isn't to say that he's not a charismatic person, but as I mentioned, warm, decisive, outreaching. One of the other things that he mentioned from the balcony was the word peace. That was his opening greeting. Peace be with all of you. Some other pieces, as you mentioned, being a bridge builder. Another thing that he mentioned is that God loves everybody. Those were all hallmarks of Francis's pontificate. And I think in the very early stages, as we are right now, as we move and progress through this pontificate, we will see hallmarks of the Francis pontificate sort of blossom as we move forward.
Rich, kind of how the church is perceived worldwide right now. It's been kind of mired in many scandals as of late, just to be frank. And I wanted to ask you this. Does the death of a pope, the conclave, the selection and election of a new pope, the inauguration of a new pope, does that re-inspire into, lapsed Catholics, non-Catholics, to reconsider this extremely ancient religious tradition, do you think? I was seeing, you teach young students. I was seeing on social media in the last couple of days, young students hold mock conclaves in their school, not mock elections, this is not Model UN, hold mock conclaves. And I thought that was maybe, it speaks to, a recommitment, a re-inspiration for those who might be lapsed, who might be coming to the Catholic faith for the first time. Do you think that's a moment for the church to really take hold of?
Absolutely. Papal conclaves don't happen that often. Our last one was in 2013. For many of our young people in the church, Francis was the first pope that they know, and now Leo. And so I feel that this great awakening, if you will, that the church in the United States needs, is in dire need of, in terms of people returning to the pews, in terms of a charism that maybe has been lacking in the last several decades. This might be the greatest opportunity for a reawakening. And perhaps it was the cardinals in the conclave that saw that and looked to then Cardinal Prevost to be that harbinger of a reawakening of the church in the United States.
That is a good point, and of course, the fact the language, the fact that he was able to speak Italian, speak Spanish there, speaking to some of his roots, his upbringing in Peru, although he did not speak in English. I want to ask you about that in terms of the language and how we can kind of transcend that, because we've seen the Catholic faith grow in different parts of the world, here in the United States as well. Can you speak to that? How important is that to be able to communicate with different portions of the world, be able to communicate with people here in the United States? And does that revival that you speak of, is that also predicated on the fact that he'll be able to communicate in English with people here in the United States so well?
So he's fluent in English, obviously being from the U.S., but he's also fluent in Spanish and obviously Italian. He spent his time in Rome as the prior general and then in the Curia. But I believe that this is a golden opportunity for him, and he will have to travel in order to do that. The idea of being a pope who just simply resides in Rome really escaped with the pontificate of John Paul II. And I believe that Pope Leo will follow that same suit. For instance, there were several trips that were already being planned for Pope Francis, which he was unable to make. There's World Youth Day, which will be coming up in a year or two. And so those will be monumental moments for him to capture the imagination of youth throughout the entire world.
You know, Rich, we have discussed, especially in the wake of Francis's passing, you know, how doctrinal Francis was in keeping with so many of these, you know, dogmatic tenets of the Catholic faith. Is Leo XIV going to be kind of a straight line? Is there a straight line from Francis to Leo, or will they diverge, or will they, you know, depart from each other in some capacity? I have here, like Francis, he opposes ordaining women as deacons, for instance. That was kind of a key inflection point and focal point brought up in some of these synods in recent church history. So I have to ask, because Francis had his critics, does Pope Leo XIV have his critics going into the papacy, or is there going to be some grace period, some leeway, some wiggle room for him to find his footing?
Sure. You know, Pope Leo was present at the synod in October. And so he is someone who sees the church walking on a journey together. That's what synodality means. But to your question regarding some of the doctrinal pieces, Francis really never changed doctrine in the church. But what he did was he believed that the doctrine did develop over time. And what I see in Leo XIV is not only a continuity in that, but the continuation of the synodal process. Pope Francis, even from his hospital bed at Gemelli in Rome, called for a gathering of ecclesial movements in 2028, in October of 2028. And I think the Pope now will see that as a mandate, if you will, from the previous pontificate and follow through on that as well. But I do think it will take some time to adjust to the role. It's often said that the man doesn't shape the papacy shapes the man. Yeah. And I think in this kind of situation, we have one of those opportunities to do just that.
So one of the issues I want to bring up, Andy Mack was kind of describing language, and Pope Leo XIV, he's a polyglot, he knows multiple languages. Latin, though, is the Vulgate of the church, the universal language of the church. We know how Francis felt about the Latin Mass in particular here. Do we know how Pope Leo XIV will approach those adherents of the Latin Mass, those attendees of the Latin Mass who want to go to the Latin Mass? If our viewers don't know what the Latin Mass is, you can kind of easily summarize that for them. But how will he approach that issue? That was a key issue before Francis died.
Sure. Then Cardinal Prevost was a member of the Curia when Traditionis Custodes was issued, and that was Pope Francis's document that he issued, not banning the Latin Mass, but restricting it in certain places in the church and in the world. I think that Cardinal Prevost has not taken a stand on that, and that is something that has yet to be seen. But especially in the U.S., that has been a source of division. It is not a large majority, but a tiny but very vocal minority. And being from the U.S., as Prevost is, as Pope Leo is now, it'll be interesting to see how he addresses that, in what ways he addresses that as well. He's a South Chicagoan, and Cardinal Cupich here in Chicago has allowed some of the Latin Mass to continue in Chicago parishes, but by and large has held fast to Traditionis Custodes that Pope Francis published just last year.
All right, very good, and a good explainer of what's going on. So many of these traditions, so many of these rituals, you're not very familiar with, especially if you're not in the Catholic faith, you don't pay attention that closely, and we don't see, like you mentioned, a conclave every so often. Of course, before I let you go here, Rich, I'm going to put up a shot just because we know Chicago and people in the United States, they have their own different flavors, and when you hear a pope from different parts of the world, you're not really familiar with different portions of it. Here in the United States, you're very with Chicago, what the essence of Chicago, White Sox or Chicago Bears, is deep dish really a casserole or is it a pizza? But in terms of this being the first American pope, the first time that a Pope Leo now raising to this level, the United States, America, maybe not necessarily the front runners in terms of all of this media selection around them because we are such just a headwind for this, a superpower of the world. Do you think that will rub people the wrong way at all to see the Pope come from America? Or do you think that's not something that happens? It's going to be unifying behind Pope Leo.
Sure. I think that going into the conclave, the last thing people had on their minds was the option of electing an American pope. Now that that has happened, there are unknowns that we are not privy to yet. Those would be general congregations that happened leading up to the conclave, the actual voting tallies. Eventually, those were released later on in Francis's pontificate, but there must have been a decisive moment that the cardinals, the 133 electors, began to rally around Prevost. He was elected on the 4th ballot. That's the same ballot that Benedict XVI was elected on. And so it was a rather quick process. And yet you had this global body of cardinals who really didn't know each other prior to this conclave. And so for some reason, it was Benedict who said, well, the Holy Spirit doesn't necessarily pick the Pope. The Holy Spirit tries to guide the cardinals. And sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. And so I feel like that is something that remains to be seen. But I will say this. Cardinal Christophe Pierre, who is the Apostolic Nuncio to the U.S., he's 79, and so he just made it under in order to get into this conclave. It would be hard to imagine that he and Cardinal Cupich and Cardinal Tobin, Cardinal McElroy, Cardinal Wilton Gregory from D.C. did not have some role as, quote, kingmakers in this conclave. We may not know soon, but eventually we may.
That is a very good point, and of course sequestered in secret, signing this oath, so we may never know the true vote, the true kind of way this conclave went, and it's so very interesting to dissect into that. But we do know for certain Pope Leo XIV making his appearance today after the white smoke billowed. Rich Rejo, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight, your perspective here on Live Now.
Thank you. Good being with you.
All right. Thank you so much. A great conversation there as we're continuing to react to the stunning news, the white smoke coming out of the Sistine Chapel, signifying the selection, the election of a new pope. And before we go back to some of the reactions, some of the sound, I'm just going to hand it off to my colleague, Andrew Kraft, one more time. Andrew, obviously stunning news that this comes down. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just some of my final thoughts. So we'll be, obviously covering this throughout the course of the day. And Andy, you're a student of history, and unfortunately, it looks like my camera just moved there. We apologize. I have to just note that, America is celebrating its 250th birthday next year. This is a 2,000-year-old institution, the Catholic Church. The United States is, world historically speaking, extremely young, and to see kind of an American Catholic be elevated to the role of Supreme Pontiff, you're kind of seeing this, American Catholic supremacy now with the papacy of Leo XIV. That, to me, is really moving and is really stirring. And watching so many of the, Americans in St. Peter's Square today lift the American flag and unfurl the flag and wave the flag, and you're hearing the chanting and the roaring in St. Peter's Square when Leo XIV came out onto the balcony. It's almost like being at like an NFL game or a football game. So I'll never forget that moment. And so, like I said, we'll be kind of covering all of this throughout the course of the day. But I mean, historically speaking, in the United States, there is a long documented history of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. We've only had 2 Catholic presidents, President John F. Kennedy, also President Joe Biden. At the outset of JFK's election, some of the anti-Catholic sentiment and fervor was very, very much prominent, and it was very much present. And so you can't imagine, 60, 70 years ago of American history, what, Catholics and non-Catholics alike would say or respond to, 80 years later being told that there would be an American Pope. So it's truly stunning, and we're going to be continuing to cover it here on Live Now.
All right, Andrew Kraft, thank you so much. And as Father Ryan Muldoon talked about it, it's not kind of like a Super Bowl, but this doesn't happen every year. So the conclave coming together as a new Pope has been selected. I appreciate your time. Thanks again here, Andrew. All right, let's continue on here, a live look one more time at St. Peter's Square, as we were mentioning. So many Americans there making that pilgrimage to those grounds to see it happening, unaware that it would be history. An American Pope by the name of Leo XIV selected. Let's take you right back quickly out to Chicago to hear more reaction from the Archdiocese of Chicago, learning that one of their own, the former Cardinal now, Robert Prevost, is the Pope Leo XIV. Let's listen in.
Sure. Father Gregory, Gregory, Sakowitz, S as in Sam, AKOWI, T as in cat, Z as in zebra. I'm the rector of the cathedral. My first reaction when I heard it was announced that Cardinal Robert Prevost was named Pope, I was in absolute shock. Happily shocked. He was not on my short list. He was on my top 10 list. Here's the ironic part. When he was named in Chicago, at that moment I looked outside here in Chicago, the sun came out. The sun came out. So we say, what a coincidence the sun came out. A coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Now, one burning question I have is the fact that the Pope Leo XIV, Cardinal then, Robert Prevost, was born in Chicago on the South Side. Is he a Chicago White Sox fan? I don't know. He's a Cubs fan. I heard he's a Cubs fan. Well, God bless him. God bless all the fans. I've heard, I think he was born in Dalton. I don't quote, well, you're already quoting on that one, okay, so we'll see. But here's the thing. 2 things that strike me. Number one, he has been the lead or the head, the castery for making bishops worldwide. Therefore, it tells me this. He was very well known by the other cardinals in the conclave. And number two, the fact that he was born in Chicago, American raised, he spent time in Rome, also in Latin America, means he's got great diversity and background and will be heavily into social justice, speaking as a voice for the poor. Those are some of my immediate thoughts that come out. I've heard as Bishop Sullivan said about his kindness, his goodness, and it's very important to know that he might be Chicago-born, United States, but he is the Pope following Peter in that line of succession for the world. I think there's got to be a sensitivity and a care, and open and listening, forgiving, compassionate. That needs to be Christ. Put on Christ.
All right, you're just listening in there to the Archdiocese of Chicago react to one of their own as Cardinal Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, as the announcement came down earlier as we were all watching it unfold in real time, and that was at 6:07 local time. This was what we saw. The seagulls may have viewed it first, the white smoke billowing from that chimney high atop the Sistine Chapel, signaling the election of a new pope. And it was about an hour later that he did make his first appearance on the balcony, taking the name Leo. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox, as we are talking right now with CEO of Salt and Light Media, Father Haig. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. It was a stunning day. We're going to use that one over and over again. We're going to need a thesaurus. Shocking, stunning for all of this. What was your initial reaction, and what are your thoughts about Pope Leo and what he can bring to the Catholic Church?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Andy. Once again, it's great to be here with you tonight on this exciting historical day. I mean, we're watching history unfold and be written right before our very eyes. The energy in St. Peter's today was absolutely incredible. Millions of people there present from all different parts of the world. And when we saw that white smoke happen, come right before our eyes, it was a moment that I'm sure thousands and hundreds and thousands of people will never forget in their life. And then, of course, the anticipation after seeing that white smoke and waiting for the Holy Father to be announced and who it will be, only to find out that we have an American for the very first time. I don't know, Prevost himself taking on the name as Pope Leo XIV, and a minute to never ever forget. And it was so exciting. Of course, when he came out and his first words being, "May the peace of the risen Lord be with you all," in Italian, I think that spoke volumes, especially when we look at what's going on in the world today.
That is a very good point. And I want to ask you, just having been there for this moment, as we see the smoke clear and you have some of these shots that we're getting into our Live Now newsroom, can you take me through the moment of when you see smoke, when you hear murmurs among the crowd, and how quickly it turns to celebration, jubilation there in this year of Jubilee?
Absolutely. So it was, of course, I mean, we had seen the black smoke a couple times before we saw the white today in the evening. And it was actually funny, if I can kind of paint the picture. The crowds were getting excited. Of course, there were a couple of seagulls up on that chimney. And at one point, there was a baby seagull. And the uproar that happened when they saw that was almost as if the smoke had already started to blow. But shortly after that first uproar, then we started seeing the white smoke. And then with my team, we were actually up on the balcony directly diagonal from where the Holy Father came. So we had a nice aerial bird's eye view of everything. And you can just see thousands of people running from every single corner in Vatican City, coming to the plaza, trying to get in. And the chants that were happening, the flags that were being waved, and the joy on people's faces within the media areas, and then all the faithful that were there, it was an incredible moment for sure. It was a sense of relief, it was a sense of joy, it was a sense of excitement, but most importantly, it reassured that hope that people were looking for in this sede vacante, in this open seat, if you will, in the Holy See.
That is so very cool to hear and talk about your perspective there in Rome for this. And like you mentioned, the talk about the white smoke, that kind of moment, and the hour lead up, because now you know, and the anticipation can only build to when you hear Habemus Papam, the announcement of a new pope. You don't know what the name is going to be. Were there conversations on the ground? Did they ramp up about who they were, or just this excitement that there was a new pope overwhelmed those?
That's actually a great question. There were murmurs, but you were hearing half a dozen different things. And then at the end of the day, I think no matter who was making any sort of comment, we all knew that we weren't going to find out until we see and hear with our own eyes and ears. So that was very special when, of course, we heard the announcement of Cardinal Prevost name, and him taking on the name. Of course, it was announced in Latin of Leon the 14th, which is an incredible image. I mean, very reminiscent, of course, to actually St. John Paul II when he came out wearing his papal stole in a dark burgundy. It was a very special moment, and I think what was even more special was the look on the Holy Father's face. There was humility, there was emotion, and there was acceptance. Because if you think about it, shepherding the church and faithful and non-faithful alike all around the world and being a true father figure for the entire world is the responsibility that we really saw in his eyes this evening, something that he was accepting of. So it was a special moment.
Yeah, and you mentioned the emotion on his face to be in this because he was just recently elevated by Pope Francis to Cardinal just a few short years ago in 2023, I believe.
That's
Can you
correct.
talk about that and how special it might be for him? Because he's also just age 69, so more on the youthful side in terms of this, that he will have some time. We can't predict the future, but it feels like he'll have years to really shape his role as Pope Leo. Can you speak to that fact about having a pope for today, but also a pope that will extend into tomorrow, into the future?
Absolutely. So, I mean, when he was created a cardinal in 2023 on September 30th, actually, which is, if we dig a little bit deeper, has a lot of significance because September 30th, the day that he was created a cardinal, is the Feast of the Archangels. And what's really special about that is Pope Leo XIII was the Pope that wrote the prayer to Saint Michael. So God is working in mysterious ways. He was, of course, elevated to the College of Cardinals at that time for his pastoral leadership, his missionary spirit, his deep fidelity to the church and teaching authority. And then, of course, he was also serving as the prefect for the dicastery of bishops. So here we are now with the Holy Father, youthful, full of energy. God give him strength and good health to serve a long pontificate so that energy will be carried on throughout the entire church and to young people today. And I think there's something very special to be said about having a cardinal elected pope at that particular age, because this is a very intricate and very important pontificate when we look at everything else that's going on in the world right now.
That is a very good point. Sorry, continue.
Please. Yeah, it's... Yeah.
Let me ask this of you, Father, as we talk about this, about Pope Leo and what he will bring in his time there as the pontificate. And we talk about Pope Francis as being a pope for the poor, bringing in the people at the margins, more closer to the center there of the Catholic Church. Pope Leo has been described in somewhat the same way, social warrior of sorts for those people. Is Pope Leo cut from the same cloth as Pope Francis, and will their paths, their kind of motives, their points of focus be similar?
I'm sure that based on what we heard in his preliminary blessing this evening, that there will absolutely be a continuity. However, if we were to describe Pope Francis's pontificate, perhaps based on the value of mercy, based on the first few words that we heard from the Holy Father this evening, I think it's safe to say that Pope Leo XIV's pontificate will absolutely be focused on peace in a world that needs it more than ever.
Yeah,
he spoke a lot about bridge building. He spoke about the importance of peace. He spoke about what it means to have peace internally within each and every single person and on a global scale.
Yeah, that is so very interesting. You mentioned the building the bridges. He's also saying keep our arms open so we can all walk together, really a unifying message from the very beginning. I also want to ask you, because we talk about the fact that this is the first pope from America, from North America. Obviously, the upbringing has very a Latin feel, with Peru being very involved in shaping him in his role in his faith. I want to ask you, because he spoke in Latin, he spoke there Italian and Spanish, There was no English heard from him in his first address to the world. Obviously from Chicago, fluent in English. How important is that language for him to expand those reaches and have an impact on the United States where he is from?
Absolutely. So language is I mean, that's our means of communicating today. And I think the fact that he decided to give a short blessing in Spanish, I think truly embodied what we just discussed about his ability to build bridges, particularly with those from the peripheries. So him recalling, despite the fact that he was just elected Pope, him taking us back to his missionary years in Peru with that short greeting, I think spoke volumes of what it means, of how grounded Pope Leo XIV's pontificate will be in humility. Of course, he knows. Of course, he knows, and he takes pride, of course, in being born in Chicago. And we, just like yourself, we all look forward to his first message in English. But I think the fact that he decided to say a few words outside of Italian and Spanish, I think really showed how grounded he is and the humble approach that he'll be taking in his pontificate, never forgetting perhaps some of the most challenging years in his tenure, not only as a priest, not only as a bishop, but a leader in the church at large.
That is so very well put. An emotional day, a monumental, historic day, a stunning day, to say the least. So many ways to describe what we watched as the conclave came to a finish there. Habemus Papam, the words echoed from the balcony in St. Peter's Square as you were today. All right, thank you so much, Father Haig. I appreciate your time here on Live Now from Fox and your perspective.
Thank you very much, Andy. God bless. Thank you for having us, and thank you for allowing Salt and Light to be a part of the conversation as well. We're doing amazing work together.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great stuff as always as we are covering this in full. And this was the moment earlier on today as we watched it unfold, the white smoke billowing from the chimney high atop the Sistine Chapel, marking the new era. Pope Leo elected to rise to this level. We'll slide away for a quick 2-minute break. We'll get out to more of these headlines after this.